Federal marijuana taxes violated your constitutional rights, and they were unanimously struck down by the Supreme Court in 1969. Now that story starts with racism and this Marijuana Tax Act stamp right here, and ends with Dr. Timothy Leary, the father of the psychedelic movement. You see, in the early 1930s, there was an FBI agent named Harry Anslinger, and he was the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. And he came up with the idea that rather than outlawing marijuana, they would just pass a tax that would cause the industry to self-implode. And among his various claims about the dangers of marijuana, he specifically talked about how it inspired the satanic jazz and swing music, and it actually caused white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes. And on another occasion, he even went so far as to say reefer makes, quote, darkies think that they are as good as white men. He also claimed that marijuana led to violent deliriums that resulted in violent crimes, specifically citing the case of Victor Licata, who murdered his entire family with an axe, but it was later revealed years on down the road that he had never once smoked marijuana, and it was all the result of a mental illness. So despite the American Medical Association and various other organizations testifying that these claims had absolutely no grounds and were absolutely not based in any kind of factual evidence, the law still passed Congress and was voted in as the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. And in order to show payment of this tax, existing tax stamps were overprinted, Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, and were issued in denominations of $1, $5, $10, $50, and $100. And these stamps were used to pay various taxes that were in the act, everything from a tax on prescribing, to buying, to possessing, to transferring cannabis from one person to another. But the whole idea was never to raise money, because now what the police could do is if they caught somebody in possession of marijuana, they could be busted for violation of the Tax Act rather than having to actually delegalize marijuana itself. And then in 1952, the Boggs Act was passed, which created a mandatory minimum sentence of 2 to 10 years for possession of marijuana, which meant that at this point you had to register for a marijuana tax stamp, but in doing so, you would incriminate yourself as being somebody who was using a substance that was actually illegal and could result in jail time. And that's exactly what happened to Dr. Timothy Leary, the father of the psychedelic movement of the 1960s. When he was driving in Texas, his car was searched after officers noticed a few marijuana seeds on the floor, and they found a small quantity on his daughter who was traveling with him in a small snuff box that she was carrying. Leary was charged underneath the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, and he decided that it was completely unconstitutional, and he wanted to fight it all the way to the Supreme Court. And there he successfully argued that it violated his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, because by registering for that tax stamp, he was admitting that he was doing something illegal, and as a result, complying with the law would cause him to incriminate himself in a crime. The court unanimously agreed with him, and in 1969, they struck down the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 as being unconstitutional and repealed the law, leaving us today with only these beautiful stamps as reminders, as well as the legislation that was written to replace that act, the Comprehensive Drug Abuse and Control Act of 1970 that was the start of Nixon's war on drugs.